Tech Aids together, where we work pretty hard on questions on trying to promote mathematical social sciences. And what happened is we both decided, I guess, that Evanston was a little too cold because we both moved south. I moved here to UCI, and he moved to the University of Chicago. Well, you know, being used. I was misinformed. You were misinformed. He didn't look part of stuff. So what happened then is I guess being there in the cold Chicago and Evanston and Wilmette area allowed him to get used to cold weather, so that actually when he went to Stockholm last December, it probably wasn't so cold when he picked up the 2007, along with Eric and Leo Hurwitz, Nobel Prize winners. So, Roger.
Greenland conference. It's a great privilege to talk here. I think I want to try to just talk about, hold up this book, and this is a hugely important book, and to be able to be here to celebrate it at 50th anniversary, plus or minus a year, this is a great privilege and a wonderful occasion. We need to think more carefully about conflict. I think that's what motivates that book. That's what motivates this book. This is a 1960 book, but Chapter 3, Games, Bargaining, let me get the title right. It was published in 1957 also. By Thomas Schelling, sorry, yes. Bargaining, Communication, and Looted War. And these two books together in 1957 are just hugely important. And what I'd like to do is talk for half an hour or so about the development of non-cooperative game theory as a methodology, the role of games and decisions, and I think I'd like to say a few things about strategy of conflict also in that history as absolutely vital part of the development of these ideas. I learned at lunch today that the subtitle is an introduction and critical survey of games, I'm prepared to be listed on the schedule as a fanatical true believer in game theory and rational choice modeling, and anybody who wants to attack that can put up a little straw picture of me and knock at it if you like. Proud to take that role. I think I should say personally that I, at an important stage in my life, was a student of Howard Rafa's, took his decision analysis class, and I love the rational choice model. In that class, I, like many other students, learned to see decisions as something, rational choice decisions as an important approximation to what we do in our daily lives. We make decisions, and they should be analyzed, and the utility functions and subjective probability have a role to play in understanding what our priorities are, what consistent principles ought to guide we want to guide our behavior. We understand that we don't always behave in ways that fit the theory, but we also understand that when people fail to fit the theory, that means we're predictively less accurate. That also means there's more of a market for normative teaching them to fit the theory better, and people might be willing to pay money to our students to teach them. So it's either way. I'm happy to win on that one. But I want to say, I think from that beginning, I really feel more of an economist or social scientist, and the use of rational choice modeling as a tool in economics and political science to understand institutions. I think when our job is to discuss the reform of major political economic institutions, it helps. First of all, there has to be some human welfare in there to explain why we should want to reform, and to the extent that individuals themselves are not able to, are failing to maximize their own welfare and their own individual behavior, then perhaps what we have is not such much a problem of the institution as a problem of the individuals. They need to be educated better. And I kind of like to divide social sciences into a generalized psychology, which is about where the question is how can we make the individuals better, and I'll call it a generalized economics, which is about how we make the institutions better. And for much of institutional analysis, it is hugely valuable to think systematically about the individuals in it as being good maximizers of their own welfare, because anything else, as I say, is a distraction from the analysis of the flaws of the institution. Not that that's what reality is, but it's a very, very useful approximation, and it's a very good thing, very good way to teach people to think about the problems of our society. I want to embrace and put a different light on a different spin on Tom's description of the important contribution of game theory as being the matrix. I'm aware let me back up for just one moment and say that the invitation was to talk about what's the great future. I interpreted Don's invitation saying to talk about what's the future of game theory, and I want to talk about the past, but I will say on what I think is the most important next problem in game theory, my candidate would be what should we do in an undergraduate class on game theory in 10 weeks or a semester to teach the students as much insight as possible into social problems. What game theoretic tools do you want? But now let me say, as a teacher, when I teach an undergraduate class of game theory, I like general mathematical models, and so I do want to teach them early on say this general strategic form of games, strategies, payoffs, or the Bayesian game types and strategies and payoffs. Once we get that mathematical model there, I know at the beginning you tell a story about a situation and then you put up a game model. Once they've assimilated a game model, which may be a matrix form is a very good form, or it could be some other mathematical form. Once we have a general class of game models that our students and we understand, then it's much easier to start creating new examples. You just say, you put up some numbers and everybody says, oh yeah, we understand. You don't have to say, oh, that could be, it's tedious to think of that's somebody shopping and the grocer has just behaved strangely in the following week. No, it's just those numbers, and so we can start investigating new kinds of situations more flexibly. And that's a great value for a theory, and that's what we're doing. And the question was, what should that formalism be? And it wasn't obvious, and maybe it still isn't obvious. Maybe 100 years the formalism will be different, but I think we've made a lot of progress. And I want to say the 50 years ago, some important things were happening. Let me try to tell my version of the story. I want to tell my version of the story. I want another personal statement that I think one of the most greatest things I ever got to do in my professional life was to stand up for a few minutes at an AEA luncheon after Nash, Harsanyi, and Zelton won the first Nobel Prize related to game theory, and have the assignment of talking briefly about what was so important about Nash's work. What a great assignment. I think, I may be wrong, but I believe that Cournot in 1838 is really introducing economic models with individual rational actors who are maximizing something. So we get a couple of models in Cournot where firms are maximizing profits. Utility maximization of consumers comes later. But I think the individual maximization models, I think, begin with Cournot. And of course, there's a question of, is it Cournot equilibrium, should we say Nash equilibrium or Cournot equilibrium? Because, you put together a couple of maximizers, and what do? You do Nash equilibrium. Cournot did Nash equilibrium, of course. Let me try to defend Nash and say, Cournot has one very nice little book on economics. He has a lot of books much fatter on the philosophy of science, in which you can find outlines of all of knowledge, and nowhere in that will you find the suggestion that the rational choice model was sort of fundamental approach in social science. When he does his second model, he says, using the same principles as the first, which suggests he had a concept of principles, but he then says, what happens if these oligopolists might compete over time? And then he says, probably they'll collude, and you should look at it as a monopoly problem. Don't think that there are multiple monopolists, but if you look at over time, they'll probably collude. In 1949, the year before Nash's first paper on non-cooperative game theory, Fellner's industrial organization book, in reviewing Cournot from 1838, says, Cournot's model is very useful for telling us something about real competition, but its methodology is flawed. Its methodology, it's theoretically flawed. Why is it theoretically flawed? It's theoretically flawed because Firm 2 is assumed to be reacting to the quantity produced by Firm 1. But why doesn't Firm 1 take that into account? And Firm 1 is also assumed to be reacting to the quantity produced by Firm 2. But if Firm 2 is reacting to Firm 1, why doesn't Firm 1 take that into account, its ability to influence in the model? So there's a confusion there. We all understand what the solution to that confusion is, and that's why we stand up and put up matrices and tell students simultaneous move games are completely general, because of the principle of strategic normalization. You have to understand that an argument was made, and it first appears, if you start looking back, where do ideas come from? It's again and again, you'll discover in Burrell's 1921 paper on, first paper on game theory. I think it's the second paragraph, and maybe the first paragraph, but in the middle of the paragraph, he says something that tells you that he knows. He says the decisions are, he calls them méthode de jeu, method of play, and they can be interpreted as the plan of how to play the whole game, a longer game. He just says that. He doesn't. And in von Neumann's 1928 paper, a few years later, von Neumann starts the paper by saying, let's have a section where we do a long game, and then we'll have a Spielmethode, a method of play, obvious translation of méthode de jeu, which to me is the smoking gun that answers the question that von Neumann left ambiguous. Had he actually read Burrell before, he says, he says, his 1928 paper says, after finishing this, I read Burrell's 1927 paper, after. But he doesn't say whether he'd read the 21 paper he read. Anyway, the concept, let me say, by the way, one other thing about Burrell. Burrell's first paper also, the game is, he says the game is all about, the underlying game is going to be one guy wins or the other guy wins. It's a zero-sum game, and one wins or the other wins. Consequently, all the payoffs are in the matrix, all the payoffs are in probability of win. And therefore, expected value maximization is correct without any derivation at all. Because he's talking about maximizing within different payoff, different outcomes, what you get is a different probability of win, and so the ex-ante probability of win is correct. So Burrell introduces randomized strategies in 1921, and he doesn't need utility theory, he's done it right. Later on he talks about payoffs, but at first it's as if he knew that all that was there. Von Neumann, in 1928, the first great contribution is strategic normalization. He does this tedious, awful, long he defines an extensive form game in a very complicated way. Things continue over time. Then he says, look, you can define a plan, the Spielmethode, which then translates into English as strategy, that's going to be a rule for every stage, and then we can make this normal form table that and without loss of generality. On the fourth page of the article, he says that without loss of generality, we can study games where people make decisions independently. And that's it. By the then proves them in a Max theorem, and then at the end of the book, end of the 1928 article, he says, what if now let's talk about three players? And he says, well, it depends in the three players who talks to who first. But he said on page 4, without loss of generality, they can make decisions before anything happens. And now he's saying, no, who talks to who first? So then he creates the characteristic function game. And now, let me say something. I guess not only is this book in print and selling well, but von Neumann and Morgenstern is still, I think, in print. I wouldn't want anyone to read von Neumann and Morgenstern. I would want, this is the book. This book is still worth reading. So what von Neumann and Morgenstern did in 1944 and 47, I think that what they really, there's very little that's not in the 1928 paper. Everything's characteristic function game, coalitional form game. One of the most important thing they do is they create the field. The history is, work kept being done independently. After von Neumann and Morgenstern, there was a tradition. Everyone knew where to find the tradition, where the literature was. There's the orange volumes. I have something else here. This I believe put up. You can see things I brought. This is the other. This is a printout of a photocopy of the tables of contents of the 1950s Princeton Orange volumes. Annals. That's it. That's game theory in the 1950s. I think von Neumann proved the existence theorem in 1928. Let me just point out, by the way, the pop quiz of how did von Neumann and Morgenstern justify their assumption of transferable utility, which they then use for everything in their characteristic function game? If you look at why do they assume payoffs are money, it says in the beginning, amazingly, they say, we're going to assume money because we want to avoid problems, we want to avoid questions of measurement. We don't even want to talk about it. So let's just assume payoffs are money. Therefore, of course, they're transferable. Therefore, we can summarize what a coalition can do by a single number, and there's the whole book. But if it really bothers you, we'll address the measurement question in appendix that isn't even in the first edition. Of course, it is one of their great contributions. The axiomatic characterization of cardinal utility for decisions under risk, under uncertainty. Expected utility maximization that people have been doing since Bernoulli in 1712, I think, is finally characterized by von Neumann and a complicated system of axioms but ultimately it's a separation argument, of course. It's a separating hyperplane theorem, duality. And it's Nash who didn't pay close attention, who says, you know, look, what von Neumann said in the beginning was really the right thing. Without loss of generality, we should study decisions made independently. I think Nash's contribution into non-cooperative game theory were three. One, a general definition. Two, a general existence theorem that was an easy application of Kakutani, or somewhat harder when you make it an application of Brouwer. And then the third thing he says is this, look guys, this Nash equilibrium, this equilibrium concept of non-cooperative, this is the general solution concept for everything. And how does he say that? He says, all this cooperative stuff, this discussion of who's going to be in what coalition and what they're going to pay each other and what contracts to sign, that's just a process where people are going to do things. They could plan it in advance, just like von Neumann said in the beginning, and without loss of generality, we can reduce it to a one-stage normal form game, and that's how you study it. And then you study it by... Somehow that didn't resonate with anybody. But there was, in 1951, what happens next in non-cooperative game theory? Because it's now the dominant tradition. That's how we do stuff now in economic analysis. Price theory has got another big methodology that sits next to it in the textbooks that came out since the 90s. Non-cooperative game theory, Nash equilibrium. I have a textbook on game theory that was published in 1991. I thought I was fairly revolutionary because I had only 3 out of 10 chapters, 30% of cooperative game theory. About non-cooperative game theory, I think it's about maybe 40% of the page count in Luce and Rafa, and that was revolutionary then. They say on page, when they introduce, where's it? I'm going to get the quote and read directly. It says here, what we've studied in the last chapter is not the mainstream work in N-person games, when they were talking about non-cooperative game models and something close to it. Most of what's going on, most of the work, most of it, basically, it said, what begins in chapter 8, this is revolutionary, what begins in chapter 8 on characteristic functions game, they're saying at the beginning of chapter 8, this is what is most of what is done in game theory today, and it's only this much of their book, it's even less of mine. And by the way, I mentioned my book because all the books since then have none of the cooperative game theory, almost all. Maybe anybody here an author of a recent, since 1990 book that has some cooperative game theory in it? And good, there we go. Yes. we are the leftover. You and I, anyway. We're not revolutionaries anymore. We're conservatives. Anyhow, Harsanyi and I think the major landmarks of non-cooperative game theory after Nash are 1967 Harsanyi's introduction of Bayesian games, 1973 Harsanyi's paper on purification of randomized strategies, how to understand, how to interpret randomized strategies by taking them back to games with a little bit of imperfect information. Zelton's Perfect Equilibrium, Subgame Perfect, and Perfect Equilibrium in 1975, and then Krebs and Wilson's Sequential Equilibrium in 1982. Lots of other papers are written. I wrote some papers too, but I think the methodology, what happened between 1951 and 1967 is the big gap, and that's what I want to celebrate today. Let me say, if you go through Harsanyi's written work and Zelton's written work and ask, where do these people, these two great leaders in non-cooperative game theory, Aumann and Moschler from the late 60s on were also working in non-cooperative. Oh, I missed one. Aumann, in my list of great advances, I read only 4. Aumann's 1974 correlated equilibrium. To me, that also needs to be counted as one of the great advances. I've got 5 of them that I want to say, all between 67 and 82. Aumann and Moschler were more eclectic and were following after. Zelton and Harsanyi were the people who began to push the Nash program in the 60s, but both of them did great work in cooperative game theory earlier. And if you look, where did they first start talking about non-cooperative game theory? For John Harsanyi, it's in a 1961 paper where he is responding to Thomas Schelling's criticism. He says, Harsanyi wants to find principles of symmetry that will give him a unique equilibrium for every game, and unique solution for every game. And Thomas Schelling, in Strategy of Conflict Directly, looks at some of that work and says, there are lots of equilibria of games, and all of that's going to matter. Harsanyi hasn't been talking about Nash equilibrium before that. He's talking about solutions of games, but they're not non-cooperative games. And in a footnote in his response to Schelling in 61, he says, and I'm going to also look at non-cooperative. I'm going to show how my same theories that are like Nash bargaining solution, generalizations of the Nash bargaining solution, can also be applied to non-cooperative games, because he wants to cover everything. And within a year or two later, he starts recognizing, once he starts thinking seriously about non-cooperative game theory, and I think Harsanyi really wanted to find a coherent general methodology, he suddenly realizes Nash was right, that he should be doing non-cooperative game theory. And in the 1970s, he was saying, like Paul referring to his, before he was in Damascus, I used to do cooperative game theory. That was when I used to do cooperative game theory. But the conversion begins in a response to Schelling. Similarly, and I think possibly independently, Zelton, again in a 1964 paper on axioms of cooperative game theory, where he's trying to extend cooperative game theory to cooperative game analysis to extensive form games, to go back to the dynamic games. In a footnote at the end, he says, basically, I've been reading Schelling, and I realize that there's a problem of commitment that I've been ignoring that's really important, and we need to think more about that. You can't think about the problem of commitment. The cooperative approach, which you boil first thing down to one stage, and then everybody settles everything by commitment, the beginning in the negotiation process, the dynamics of commitment, that you put me in a situation tomorrow, would I really want to carry out my promise or my threat? That's completely buried in the cooperative approach. You can't even raise the question in the traditional methodology. And it's clear that none of that stuff, what everybody was doing, and that Luce and Rafa put in just, here's the non-cooperative fanatic that I am, that Luce and Rafa, in their revolutionary approach, consigned to about half of the book. It's clear the kinds of pressing problems of international relations that Schelling was dealing with, it was worthless. Trying to fit it into characteristic function form with transferable utility got you asking the wrong questions. And this point that the guy with the 25,000 and the 30,000 and the 15,000, 20,000, the 25,000, the 15,000 alternative is exactly the kind of problem that people were talking. It was as applied as they got in characteristic function game in von Neumann's and Morgenstern's book. So I do want to argue that. So look, Luce and Rafa. What's in? Put these two together up there, and I want them in front of you, in parallel, as a visual symbol of what was done right in 1957 that everything was built on. Now I want to say what's wonderful in Luce and Rafa. I'm going to read it is a critical survey. Let me read the challenge. I'm looking at page 104. The book says, do these examples sound the death knell for the equilibrium concept as the principal ingredient of a theory of non-cooperative, non-zero-sum games? Now, in our opinion, the answer must be yes, if one demands a realistic theory for all possible non-cooperative, non-zero-sum games, but it's no if one is willing to restrict the set of games for which it is asserted that, quote, solution exists. Now, they did say, maybe Nash, contrary to Nash, we're going to kill and bury the concept that non-cooperative game models is to be the orthodoxy for everything. Well, it wasn't dead, of course, it's gone to take everything. And yet, I want to argue, having read that into the record, that Luce and Rafa did make it happen. Made it happen, let's just talk about the chapter, I want to say something about the chapter outline of it. Chapter 2 is utility theory. The first thing you get when you read Luce and Rafa is you have to get the decision theoretic foundations right. We have to start, we need to think carefully about conflict, but that needs to begin by thinking carefully about individual decision making. So, utility theory is done carefully in chapter 2. Subjective probability is deferred to the end in chapter 13 because it's not needed for the next things. Chapter 3 is strategic normalization. We set down the extent, a general model of extensive games where play continues over time. Then we argue that they can be reduced to one-stage games, and without loss of generality, we can consider conflict between individuals as being something where people make independent decisions. What's the answer to Cournot about the dynamics? Cournot said, my independent choice model doesn't apply when the firms watch each other over time. What's the answer to Fellner, who thought there was something inconsistent about Cournot analysis? If firm 1's quantity today influences firm 2's quantity next year, well, that's just part of the strategy that firm 2 has. And without loss of generality, we could assume that today, firms 1 and 2 are choosing quantity to produce today And the rule for how their quantities next year will depend on this year, and that's what's done today. So we can really think that sitting around talking about the principles of analysis of simultaneous move games feel to us like a very general way of thinking about games because we can reduce it. And Luce and Rafa let us know how that's done, and they do it right. Chapter 4 is two-person zero-sum games. And this is where they are the advocates of non-cooperative game theory beautifully. Because in the previous work, if you go back to what Borel is doing at the beginning, he's looked at zero-sum games and he's mainly thinking about it as maximum security level. And that logic dominates also von Neumann's approach. And the fact that it's also an equilibrium is there. You can see in the analysis of two-person zero-sum games, it's there. In chapter 4, this is a modern treatment, modern for those of us who are in the non-cooperative dominated orthodoxy of today, of 2008. Maybe there'll be another orthodoxy in the future, but that's where I'm standing. Chapter 4 treats the two pretty much co-equally. Actually, I think the equilibrium interpretation is stronger. The maxim-min security level justification is introduced a few sentences earlier, but much more of the emphasis, just in two-person zero-sum games, is on that this is an equilibrium solution. There is a section that begins, that is entitled, An A Priori Demand of the Theory. And that is saying, it is a priori demand, and that is the section where the equilibrium property is examined in detail. It said, look, our authors are telling us it is a priori demanded that whatever theory we have, it had better be that when each guy thinks it's predictive of the other person, that it will be prescriptively appropriate for himself. That is, it must be a Nash equilibrium. It is argued beautifully in my orthodox, non-cooperative Nash program textbook of 1991. I think it's possible, I'm going to panic on this from last night, I'm looking at this in the plane, that I might have just copied their words. I mean, I thought I was explaining it beautifully. I think I was just repeating what I read in Luce and Rafa. And this is, by the way, in two-person zero-sum game theory, already it's done, it's emphatically done that way. Chapter 5 is the two-person general sum games in strategic form. And I want to emphasize the examples that lead to their sentence with this on the basis of the sentence on the basis of above examples. Maybe this is the death knell for anybody thinking that this is the most general possible solution concept. That non-cooperative equilibrium analysis should be viewed as a general methodology. No, that's a bad idea. What are the examples? The examples are the main examples that they're referring to are the Battle of the Sexes game, a game with two very different equilibria plus where a 2x2 game where there are two non-equal, I should say. One of the two important properties in zero-sum games that are very clearly emphasized are if there are multiple equilibria, they are equivalent, they give the same payoffs, and they are interchangeable. If one person thinks he's playing one equilibrium, the other thinks he's playing the other, well, when they combine that, the new combination is also an equilibrium. No problem. That's false in the Battle of Sexes game. And this is a problem, and I think the answer in Chapter 3 of Strategy of Conflict, published in the same year, essentially teaches us to think of it differently. What we learn from Schelling is, coordination problems are a part of life. They are an important part of what societies have to deal with. If you deny that, if you had a theory that said, for every game, and Harsanyi and Zelton always wanted to have a theory of a unique equilibrium for every game, and maybe, and they understood that it wasn't about, that theory was not to be applied to real life, but to a question of if you had a game played in a completely neutral environment with no cultural factors at all, what would happen? Okay, but maybe we should want such a theory, good, but the fact that there are what we now call as multiple equilibria tells us a lot about culture. It tells us a lot about what an arbitrator does, what a social leader does in a focal arbitrator. And so the multiple equilibria becomes the feasible set so our interpretation of what a solution concept was needed was transformed by Schelling's book, and then suddenly the Battle of Sexes game didn't look like a problem, like a fatal flaw, but rather an opening up of game theory to the influence of culture, the influence of creating opportunities for interveners to be able to steer us to one equilibrium or another, to the extent that we recognize these leaders or interveners or arbitrators. The other game is the finitely repeated prisoner's dilemma, which Howard talks about today, and there it's a little more subtle what happened next. I think the short answer is that we needed the normalization to understand how to begin to organize our thinking. The normalization telling us we could work in the conceptually simple strategic form simultaneous move games and know that without loss of generality we were talking about everything. That was a convenient simplification that enabled us to get started. But we knew that there were some equilibria which, when you went back to the extensive form, might be imperfect in Schelling's strategy of conflict. And here, iterative dominance is considered as a way of recognizing in the strategic form what becomes clear when you go back to the extensive form. Zelton in 1975 teaches us, and also in German a few years earlier, teaches us we really need to look at the extensive form, and maybe just that argument for an a priori demand on the theory, that argument for Nash equilibrium, says whatever theory you have, it must be a Nash equilibrium, but it doesn't say that all Nash equilibria have to be equally good. And it may be that in the extensive form we need to refine a few away. It's Krebs and Wilson who I think finally give us what is now the standard methodology, the sequential equilibrium analysis in the extensive form, and say, oh, some of these are bad equilibrium. But what is one of the first applications of sequential equilibrium is to the finitely repeated prisoner's dilemma, where, yes, of course, as Luce and Rafe already showed, if it's perfect information, the unique equilibrium is everybody should defect all the time, which is so manifestly the wrong thing to do in a real game that it just seems silly. But what Krebs and let me get them in alphabetical order. Krebs and Milgram and Roberts and Wilson show in 1982 is that if you take that game and perturb it slightly by putting in players who have some small probability of being actually behavioral tit-for-tat people, you just take this game and perturb it slightly. Now you get a new game where there's a little bit of doubt about, are you really the rational person? In Harsanyi's Bayesian game framework, we have succeeded in creating a game where the common knowledge of the original game is now in doubt. Some possibility of an irrational type has been introduced in a way that is we can still handle within a Bayesian game framework. And now we apply our refined equilibrium concepts of sequential rationality, and we discover that the unique sequential equilibrium of that game is exactly what Luce and Rafe said in 1957 should have been the solution, namely, you play you're nice as long as the other guy's nice until pretty close to the end. Within about 5 of the end, depending on the epsilon, you should consider breaking down the cooperation. And if do it randomly, by the way, because it's the right answer. And I would say 1982 is a pretty good estimate of the date when non-cooperative game theory became the orthodoxy. I like the word orthodoxy because it begs the question as to whether today's orthodoxy might be viewed as tomorrow as a silly preconception of those old-fashioned people. But it was when the questions that were asked in chapter 5 of Luce and Rafe are answered by an improved methodology that Nash's program was finally able to triumph. And that to me is the context in which people who studied these books are the people who felt driven to answer these questions in the 60s and 70s to create the methodology that we have today. Thank you.